All right, welcome back to the AI for 2021 Healthcare Summit. I hope you're having an amazing time so far. Our next panel is titled AI for Drug Discovery. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to the virtual stage.
Welcome, my name is Wade Davis. I'll be your moderator and co-panelist. Here with me to do introductions, I'll start with Jim.
Great, thanks Wade, and really happy to be here, everybody. I'm Jim Weatherall. I'm the Vice President of Data Science and AI in R&D at AstraZeneca. And as such, my team has accountability for implementing AI solutions right the way across the medicines development pipeline.
Thank you, Jim. Rohit.
Thanks, Wade. Hi, everyone. I'm Rohit Mahajan. I'm the managing partner at Bigrio, which is bigar.io. And we are at the forefront of AI solutions for our clients. And my personal interest is at the intersection of AI and healthcare. So I'm quite looking forward to this interaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohit. And finally, my name is Wade Davis. I'm the global head of computational biology and bioinformatics at AbbVie, where our team spans our early discovery to post-marketing and looking at various applications of AI, particularly around genomics, real-world data, and large population cohorts. It's my pleasure to be here. Let's start with the first question. So it's been a tough 12 months for sure for everyone. Has AI played a supporting role during COVID for your company? Jim, you want to take that first one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Wade. So it's the topic of the moment, isn't it? How does AI and data science sort of intersect with how we've been living and what the world's been dealing with over the last 12 or 18 months? I think supporting role is actually not a bad way to characterize it. I think from my point of view, what's played the major role is just bringing more front and center the importance of data, real-time data, for countries to be able to make decisions based on healthcare and pandemic data that they have at their fingertips. And I think in order to do that, it's sometimes, from our point of view of data science professionals, it's some relatively straightforward analytics or mathematical modeling that's required. I wouldn't say AI per se. That said, in the sort of supporting cast role, I definitely think there's been some interesting experiments in using, for instance, AI inference over knowledge graphs to identify drug repurposing opportunities for treating various aspects of coronavirus disease, or indeed, taking some of the larger data sets nationally and internationally and analyzing them more deeply. So I think supporting role for me is an appropriate way to describe it. And the greatest thing from a point of view of a data scientist about the pandemic is really bringing data science more generally into the foreground.
Thank you, Jim. I would agree with that. It's definitely, I think, given a good impetus for saying, what can we do using everything at our disposal to accelerate the activities across the company and to potentially change the way we're doing something given the situation. So it's been a real, I would say, test bed, not for, more about the rollout, that things that had been discussed, how could we manage a trial or do some things differently when everybody's working remotely? So it's been the spark, a needed spark, I think, to push some folks over the edge to try some new things. But on the practical sense, from a chemistry, from a repurposing side, we've also had the same experience. At least I have personally not seen anything with so much time constraints on it. Obviously, the impact to the economy and to our companies and obviously folks around the world, it's really been an opportunity to use all the tools at our disposal to drive things forward. Rohit.
Yeah, adding to that, Jim and Wade, I was very fortunate to attend a session at the Harvard Business School where Stephen from Moderna was one of the participants as well. And to me, the whole story about bringing a vaccine to market in such a short period of time during this COVID era is really fascinating. And the way, Stefan described it during the conversation was that the company, is a tech company which happens to do biology. So that, leads me to think that they are using AI and digital transformation at the core of the company. The timelines itself are fascinating. What I heard during the conversation was that on January 11th is when I think the genomic sequence of the virus was posted online by the team at Wuhan. And within 2 days, apparently the team at Moderna had already designed the vaccine. And from then, it was a matter of time of, I think, 4 more weeks before they were able to send it into clinical trials over at NIH at DC. So crunching the time from, I think, the previous record was probably 6 months during the SARS vaccine time. And this was done in, I think, less than 2 months. So there was a huge, uh, I would say, factor of efficiency that was brought into the whole picture. And I think one of the core reasons for that was that the way Moderna is using AI at its core.
Yeah,
Sure.
I'd love to build on that, Rohit. I think that's great to bring some extra examples of acceleration. I think, Wade, you mentioned clinical trials, and there's definitely, it's pushed companies and it's pushed us to figure out how we virtualize and do more kind of device-based digital data collection. And some of those solutions have a potential to sort of enter the AI domain. I guess we're not being too fussy about definitions today, but really the whole acceleration of the Internet of Things in healthcare and how that might change the future of clinical research is definitely something to keep an eye on. And I wanted to sort of give one other example as we're gradually sort of enriching the conversation here is I've seen some projects, and we were involved in one as well, that sort of looked at the use of AI. So AI for imaging, I always think is an obvious example in any domain because it seems to be so repurposable. Yeah. The tools are quite strong. And there's been a few studies looking at AI for essentially analysis of chest images to diagnose or otherwise identify different types of coronavirus. And that there's an interesting review it's in Nature Machine Intelligence, which did a canvassing of a lot of studies that have tried to do just that and actually shown that many of them are flawed. Again, I sort of see that as a positive thing. I see the pandemic as sort of accelerating research into some tricky areas, and what you often see is a number of initial studies failing, but failing in a good way, failing in a way that we can learn from. So again, that might accelerate our understanding of AI as applied to imaging of the chest, or perhaps clinical imaging more generally as well.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think the sharing of information too in situations that we've seen, that's really contributed to the acceleration, right? For these tools to really work, it's everybody sharing the chest images with the truth labels to really get those things out there and learning where things are working or not working. If we think of the challenges, one thing that I think we've all noticed is the tremendous speed at which Rohit mentioned the vaccine itself was developed. But, it might not be as maybe the obvious place for more data science is on the logistics side. I think, we did not roll it out unless in the United States. We could talk about it in other places, maybe to maximize, to capture that efficiency by which the vaccine was developed. I wish the baton would have been handed off and we could have been a little more creative in rolling things out and tracking. So I think that was an opportunity where everyone could have done better. Rohit, yeah. Did you have a follow-up?
I would like to add to that, Wade, one other thing which I was chatting with some of my friends over in Germany. And one of the things that they mentioned was that COVID did drive behavioral change. So, for example, most of the research is done in wet labs. And then during COVID, you couldn't get people in the labs. So now you have this, new way of applying, let's say, bioinformatics, which you can do without being in the wet lab, maybe. So I think the whole acceleration, behavioral change driven by COVID is a pretty interesting phenomena.
Yes, and along those lines, we did roll out some new initiatives internally for trying to educate folks who may have been idling a little bit otherwise during the beginning of the pandemic, who were wet lab folks who said, well, what can I be doing to help? What tools can be made available to them? So we did change our behaviors in response. And I don't think those things will go away for sure. Well, let's turn to the next question. What challenges do organizations face when incorporating AI into the drug discovery process? Examples, please. Rohit, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure, Wade, I can start with that. What we have observed with some of our clients is that when you are doing any AI algorithms, machine learning algorithms, AI initiatives, it's all about one single thing, which is about the data. And data is exploding, like Jim said. There is data coming in from all different sources, and to get this data, which is, let's say, multi-scale data, which is multi-source data, and it is diverse data, especially from a patient perspective. To get this into some kind of a large database, which can then lead to discoveries. That, I think, is one single point which resonates across all the conversations that I have been having. And I was actually asking a few of my friends that, is there any data standards in place which will drive such a transformation in terms of data being widely available across, let's say, pharma companies, across academic medical centers, and across all the various systems. But I was pointed to the fact that it is mostly de facto, and there doesn't seem to be any such one single body which is doing a data standardization kind of work. So those were leading to some questions in my mind.
For sure. Ontologies, there's so many places you could go with standardization, and whether it's from chemical standards or ontological standards, data collection, metadata collection. There's a lot of that'll be a problem that's open for a little while, I feel. Jim.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more on the data front, but actually wanted to throw up another challenge as well, because that's not the only one. And I think there are a lot of challenges that are sort of human-based, if I can put it like that. So particularly in larger companies, the whole drug discovery process is something of a machine, very productive machine. And anytime you drop a new tool or an approach into one of those sub-processes, it has ripples. And that can cause a reluctance from scientists that are perhaps used to more traditional ways of doing things, or if you've got to persuade somebody to replace a wet lab experiment with an in silico experiment, it can be quite a jump. So I do think good old-fashioned change management is still super important, super challenging. It can be done. Actually, the question with a big exclamation point asked us for examples. So when we came to use knowledge graph inference, for instance, to look more around target biology, that was quite a big step. But I would say in about a year, we've gone from our target biologists saying, why do I need this, to target biologists saying, I can't believe we don't always use this when we're trying to identify and validate new drug targets. So I think that can be a challenge as well. And don't underestimate the change this makes to people's day jobs.
Definitely, Jim. That's now that you mentioned the elephant in the room, I'll agree. I see the same thing. That's the first thing that popped in my mind, was actually the human element of accepting accepting change, the fears that come with that, the opportunities and everything. I think there's plenty of examples of AI in the practical sense in everyone's life, you know, with Siri and Alexa and plenty of other things that don't seem so threatening, but it is a complicated human process that's been around for a long time, and people will say, well, we've gotten thus far without these things, but each time we come up with a new therapy, right, the bar is raised, and the standard of care that needs to be beat, the bar is moving, so we can't stand still, and we're definitely using some of the same tools, the knowledge graphs and the acceptance of those things are definitely cool to see. I think another thing is there's so many, the speed at which prioritizations or other tools that might show repurposing. If we just think back to the COVID-19 situation, I would guess in the first 2 months, there was a half a dozen papers with lists that made it to my team. Have you looked at this list? Have you looked at this list? What's different? These three drugs rose to the top for reprioritization. What do you think of this or that? So, you know, there's so many things, so many decision degrees of freedom, of course, that go into all those analyses. And it's not always clear, you know, there's a right or wrong decision. So I think sorting out some of the different tools now as we think of the explosion in the number of techniques and the application and data sources. So I think it's a lot for the wet lab scientists who are interested in things to sort out kind of the signal from the noise. And as we get more benchmarks or standardized data sets that will, and truth sets that could help make that more apparent. But ultimately, right, you do the experiments, the follow experiments, and you learn, and then you feed it back. So it's an exciting time for sure.
Yeah, I think just to maybe toss one more in, maybe one that's sort of coming rather than firmly with us today is regulation. We've seen the first moves in the EU, but I'm sure it will be all around the world before too long, of nations and groups of nations providing now specific regulations and rules. Like previously we saw, again, to take the example of the EU with GDPR a few years ago, and how a lot of companies had to rethink how they approach this. We're seeing the same coming in AI, and that needs to be looked at and watched very carefully, I think, in terms of, you know, to give an example, what is internal use of AI, where it might impact our choice of targets or drugs, which might be considered relatively low risk from a sort of human ethics point of view, right the way through to more high risk applications of AI, where maybe now you're rolling out a dosing algorithm or some sort of smart agent that informs whether somebody gets treated or not. So I think I predict we're going to see a lot there that could impact us in the coming years.
I think that's a great thing to bring up. I know my news feed this weekend was hit by some lead stories late, I think Friday evening, around those efforts. So I think that's true. I think it comes into also the fairness. We all know that algorithms learn more where there's more data. So what do you do about those? You know, whether it's a physical measurement, height, weight, or other BMI, other things that might affect a prediction, and you don't have as much information in some subspace of that prediction problem. We're not going to obviously do as well, or we may predict poorly. So there's definite consequences to that. How do we reveal some sort of uncertainty associated with that prediction, or acknowledge that maybe this is going to have its biases towards certain populations? So I definitely think that field will grow, and it should grow. I do think that's an area that needs more attention and to get the most out of AI, and to be transparent in how it's being used.
Yeah, Wade, I would like to chime in here with a thought process. You know, from a very high level perspective, clinical trials has been one of the longest, you know, time periods during the drug discovery entire process. So, you know, most expensive and, you know, time consuming. And I think with COVID, again, the challenge has been that patients, finding the patients, and then the patients' participations in the clinical trials. So I also think that there is a lot of room for improvement in the clinical trials process itself, and applying, AI techniques there, whether it be, virtual trials or any other ways that we can accelerate the pace in the various phases of the clinical trials. And I think a lot of challenges can be overcome in that space.
Yeah, and I think it'll be interesting. It kind of reminds me of, if we think of algorithmic trading strategies and how that's changed the market, as all the players in this space aim to accelerate, it's going to change the system, right? So we're going to have to play catch up as we implement something that looks good, but realizing that all other players in the system, or most of the other players in the system, will also be implementing such changes. How will then people respond when we're all going after maybe a subset of sites to enroll subjects? So it's going to be interesting and to keep up with these changes and realize that they're not all being made in a vacuum. Let's look at the next question, unless others have other examples to add on to the previous one. All right, so it says, what advantages can AI provide in drug discovery? Please provide examples. Advantages. Okay. Yeah, how about I'll take this one since I've been pitching them over to everybody else first.
Go for it.
Yeah, advantages in this drug discovery. I think speed is maybe the most obvious one that I see. The time that it takes to develop a drug, especially in the early part of the process before the first in human spot. I think that's a rich area. So to me, if we think about the costs that go in to a drug program, and then the pricing that needs to come out the other side in order to make that a profitable adventure, the longer a runway we have to recover those costs, then we can actually bring something to market ideally at a lower price, because you've got a longer runway potentially to work with. So I think time is the low-hanging fruit to compress some of these activities. There's also talk of things like the lab on a chip, where you think about automated experiments and the feedback loop that says, I'm going to run this experiment. If I see this, then I'll start. So I think as we converge on the robotics and the AI and the automation and the miniaturization of experiments could be a great way of de-risking target exploration.
That's great, Wade. I'd love to build on that, actually. I think what I tend to say to my stakeholders is we're trying to do two things. We're trying to go faster and we're trying to be more accurate. So I think you covered the faster and the acceleration quite nicely. And I agree that's the low-hanging fruit, because that's often the business cases you can build to get started, because they're going to show some sort of efficiencies and some streamlining, and that's all good business sense. And then, but hopefully that can also be really strongly supported by the science, and you touched on that with the miniaturization. And I think there's other things. I mean, again, we're being asked for examples, so let me throw another one in where we're using AI to help us design some of our molecules. And hopefully that will do both, actually enable our chemists to go quicker, because now they're kind of enabled and automated to go around dry lab cycles much faster than they could around wet lab cycles, but also potentially be more accurate. So we're now using AI, specifically recurrent neural networks, in a sort of reinforcement learning paradigm to learn many millions of molecular structures, and then say, how can I now come up with a molecular structure that's optimized for my particular drug? And just to sort of make the connection for the audience, when we're talking about reinforcement learning, we're talking about how can you get a computer to play chess or Go and beat a human? Well, the simplest way of explaining it is that they're trying to optimize some sort of score, which is how well it's performing in the game. So in our implementation of AI for chemistry, we have a score which is kind of the fitness of that molecule, if you will, which is a sort of composite of its stability, its solubility, its efficacy, et cetera, et cetera. And so we play those games with getting AI to help our chemists optimize, which is has been bearing a lot of fruit and is now rolled out across, I think it's about 50% of our portfolio.
Nice example, Jim. Rohit, ideas on this front from you?
Yeah, I would like to add to what Jim said, that AI basically is very good at making predictions. So, it is talking to the same point that Jim said, that which are the ways in which, better ways in which we can use AI to make predictions and shorten the time cycle to drug discovery. And I think one of the examples that I was discussing with our partner in Germany was around, what they did in the cycle, which they call the DMTA cycle, which is the design, make, test and analyze cycle, and where they are maybe starting with the end in mind. So they are able to work backwards to see which molecules can be synthesized, faster and better, and then see which ones are available, and then, kind of like work from there for better targets. And yeah, so I think that's one of the examples, that I would like to bring out here. And the second thing, going back to the Moderna case study, there I learned the very interesting fact that mRNA is actually like, maybe likened to the iPhone, and the various drugs which can be delivered via this, let's say, mechanism of mRNA can be likened to the apps. And they also, came across a very interesting vehicle, which is, the basically the wrapper for the delivery of the mRNA. So I think, innovations like this, which are more platform in nature, are definitely going to be helpful in the future, in terms of bringing therapies to patients so much faster.
Thank you, Rohit. I'd like to add, I think Jim mentioned the knowledge graph that they were using. And I think maybe putting the intelligence and artificial intelligence, I think that's what makes me think of what have we learned collectively across parts that aren't necessarily obviously connected, or maybe 2 or 3 nodes away from each other. So I think as we learn different areas of chemistry or biology, how do we assimilate the knowledge collectively that each, say, pocket or silo, it's just too much information, right, for one human to comprehend. So I see the opportunity as building that knowledge and consistently, and adding to it, and it growing, and then operating on that graph for future questions. So I really think it's the next level, so to speak, is taking those individual learnings, those predictions, and stitching those together and understanding. And ultimately, what I'm really interested in is the causal nature of what we're learning behind things, especially from a biological point of view. Maybe chemistry, I'm not an expert in chemistry by any means, and maybe there's something they could learn about the structures and why certain things happen. I probably view that too simplistically as more deterministic, but I think of biology as an area that's further behind chemistry and our understanding of how networks talk to each other and signal and proteins and all the regulatory feedback loops, if you will, of the body and its beautiful complexity. So I think, how do we disentangle that is the challenge. That if we understood that better, then our feedback loops become even better into knowing where to target for what disease.
Yeah, and I wonder, Wade, whether this is why, so-called human in the loop AI is really important here. And now I sometimes get the impression that a few years ago, the world started on a crusade to sort of almost replace human beings with AI or robots. I don't believe that's the correct approach. Not for the next few years anyway. I think what we should be doing is augmenting the work of human beings by providing them with better tools that are powered by AI. And I think the complexity of biology is a fantastic example that probably what AI is going to be really, really good at is finding patterns in data sets that are so dense, no human being is going to find that pattern. but establishing the causality and the biological mechanisms behind that, I think you still need a kind of a human brain and a biological experience to figure those things out.
Yeah, it's a fascinating field as we watch it evolve, and to understand that human in the loop. I do think that's an interesting way. If you think about the optimality or the rewards, if you think about with the different reinforcement learnings, you can think about what is it that we want to reward and go after, rather than just pure prediction and understanding. So I think that's an area of personal interest of mine, is to just understand what is it that we're learning under these systems. And adversarial attacks and examples can really shed, does the system really understand what we think it does? And so if you think about some of the, as you mentioned, imaging, right, or chess or Go, and those examples, we all know there's no doubt a human can play those games, right? We can play those games, we can be good at those games. Obviously computers can now beat us at those games, but image identification, those are tasks we know we could do it ourselves. But when we think about drug discovery, that's a less obvious, or some of these questions we're asking, it's less obvious that a human can actually do that task, and we're applying AI to repeat the task a human can do. So I think some of these early wins, speech recognition, right? Well, of course, we as humans could recognize the speech. So it is a miracle to have a machine recognize that, but we're not asking you to do something we can't do. I think it's a little more complex to say, how do we discover a drug? That's not the same as saying, is this a dog or a cat or a stoplight or a street sign? So I think those tasks, complexity, are really interesting to look at what's behind the decision making in those. Before we move on, Rohit, do you have any more to add on this topic?
Yeah, Wade, I think this is something again that I've been reading about, and a lot of, I think, companies are using it, which is using AI, and natural language processing for reading a lot of literature, which is out there in various different forms, whether they be research papers or medical literature, or even videos of people talking about stuff. So, AI with the NLP and NLU kind of capabilities has this immense appetite, right? It can literally ingest millions, if not billions, of documents and try and make some meaning and semblance out of that. So I think that the applications of those are likely to increase. So definitely, left alone, I think AI has the potential to come up with some very fine insights, and those can then be used by scientists and researchers and medical professionals to discover drugs. So,
Yeah, kind of like knowledge prefetching, right? Digest the articles and kind of suggest and point you to what you're looking for. Great. Well, it's been fun so far. Let's go to question 4. Let's talk about COVID. Was AI involved in drug discovery efforts? If so, how? Who would like to take that one?
Maybe we've cycled around, and maybe it's my turn to start again. I think we already covered some of this actually, but we could go into it a little more, of course. I do think, as was commented earlier, there was some great efforts to look at whether this could be used as a drug repositioning tool. I don't know that ultimately that ended up driving the most significant drug discovery efforts, but I think it played a sort of supporting role in kind of waking the world up to just what the power of AI can do, and that the companies that work on medicines development, are there other things that our medicines could do that maybe if we bring enough data and machine intelligence to bear, we could find out about, where existing medicines could help more and more patients. So I think there's something there in the drug repositioning. We also talked about imaging, again, maybe an example where it kind of sort of got us thinking about things in a different way, but hasn't yet kind of made it back into the core process. So I would sort of say, again, I've been really interested to compare with the two of you, but I wouldn't sort of say that AI, under the conventional definition, was the sort of mainstream of any particular drug discovery effort that I saw. But again, it sort of played a very important role in innovating, stretching our thinking, making us rethink how drug discovery could be done in the future. And certainly data science, again, if we sort of shift the definitions around it, certainly data science played a role, whether it was sort of assembling virus sequences, tuning molecular designs, figuring out how to do remote clinical trials and things like that. But it's a great question. I'd be curious to get other perspectives.
Yes, I would agree with that. I would say it's a little more on the machine learning edge, where we were looking at repurposing, and a lot of others were looking at, everybody was scanning their decks and looking at what could potentially be useful, or looking at what they had in their pipeline that had been in humans in the past, or currently, to see what made sense from either overactive immune systems, so something usually inhibiting inflammatory response, because that's what seemed to be the severe COVID cases. Looking at the virus protein envelope and looking at what you could do for antibody. So a lot of work was to then help those who were already infected to beat those back. I know Lilly and Regeneron did a lot of work in that, and many others also attempted that. So it maybe wasn't the driver, as you said. It was more of a supporting role, but those are the ways that we used it, that I've named. It definitely, I think, was more of a lever to open the door for more of these things. I think for future events, hopefully not like this, but other kind of accelerated efforts in the industry where we feel like, we want to move something forward. I mean, the challenge was we didn't know much about this disease, right? So it wasn't like, let's all go accelerate rheumatoid arthritis or oncology, some indication for that. This was, we had past SARS to look at, and some virus sequence. It wasn't that we had deep knowledge. One thing, that I thought in all the repurposing efforts, I guess we'll see what the scoreboard shows. There'll probably be plenty of review papers written over the next few years, summarizing the predictions that were made. But the real world finding in the UK for, I think it was dexamethasone for treatment for anti-steroid, that wasn't, on any of the radar from anything I saw for, maybe it's so obvious. It wasn't super complex, that you just want to reduce inflammation. But that real world evidence seemed to make, and that was more of a data science observational finding than I would say a traditional AI. But it'll be interesting to watch the tape, so to speak, in the coming years to see what signals we could have picked up to catch that faster. Rohit.
Yeah, adding to that, Wade, couple of things come to my mind. One is that, of course, in terms of clinical studies, the selection of the patients or the patient stratification, so that, the clinical trials can be done much faster. And then, of course, I think COVID is not yet over. I mean, it is still ongoing. Look at, the havoc it is causing in India at this point in time, and it is mutating, right? So new strains might be emerging for which the current vaccines may not be effective. I do not know. So I think there is a lot of runway on this, drug discovery for working further on AI applications from a COVID perspective. So I think we should see more of it in the coming few months.
Yeah, I think maybe one challenge where we could have done, I know it's not about how it was involved, but I think an opportunity was predicting those mutants. And obviously, if we understood the biology better, how such a not that many nucleotides, right? It doesn't seem like a complex problem, but just understanding how the fitness and the replication rate would change from a base substitution here or there. So it'll be fascinating to see what we can do with that data in coming years to anticipate some of these things that you mentioned, Rohit, as the variants change and the virus mutates. How can we stay out in front of that? That's an opportunity for sure for future viruses of different classes, or God forbid, another coronavirus in our future. So it's an interesting challenge that I think we should do our best to overcome. Okay, so let's look at the last question. It is the last, but I think it's the most open-ended. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time to dive into this last question. How will AI transform drug discovery over the next 5 years? Who wants to take that? Rohit, would you like to take that one?
Sure, I'll start with a couple of thoughts. I have many on this, but I'll chime in with I'll start with a couple of those. So I think the first and foremost, which I've been reading, again, a lot of, in the AI drug discovery space, that 5 years is a short period of time so far, when you look at, the whole drug discovery cycle. So it's really what is out in the next maybe 10 to 15 years from now. And the whole pace is accelerating for sure. And where I see there is a lot of potential is, applying things like, let's say, quantum computing. We are all hearing about it. We are talking about it. Some of us are doing some experimentation at the fringes of it. But I have a strong feeling that it is going to become mainstream. And with the explosion of data, right? We have so much data which is available now, which can be used for computational. So this whole thing about quantum computing will accelerate, I think, in my mind, and we'll see a quantum jump in terms of time to compute. So where it might take a days or 2 days or even weeks to compute something, it might be crunched to a minute or few minutes. So I like to start with that one thing, that I think quantum computing is definitely coming down the path of drug discovery.
Yes, and just to tack onto that from the quantum side, I think it'll have an impact. I think it'll be maybe slightly different from what you said, in the sense that maybe it won't be a speed thing, but the problem complexity and the search space that will be searched. So that maybe this is one use, instead of saying going from a day of waiting to an hour or a few minutes, but the search space and the problems you're trying to will go from non-computable or really suboptimal search to we'll say a near exhaustive search, particularly if we're talking about operations on large graphs. So I think those can be very expensive, and they searches and queries and calculation, depending on the nature of what you're trying to ask. So as those graphs grow, I think it'll become a problem that would have been intractable, turning intractable problems into tractable problems. But I think quantum is not going away for sure.
No, that's right. It's always been the innovation that's 10 years away for about the last 30 years, hasn't it? Which is in.
Jim, I think you went on mute.
There we go. Let's try again. So I think maybe you heard me say that the quantum's been the sort of innovation that's always 10 years away for the last 30 years. But I agree, with Rohit, that it will have its day. I think what's interesting at the moment, so if we do constrain ourselves to that 5-year time horizon, which I know is more challenging, what we're starting to see from quantum is actually more innovation come out of the algorithms and how creative people are being with the way you have to compute, rather than the volume or speed, which I think is similar to what you were saying, Wade. And we're actually learning from that, rather than just getting the raw horsepower benefits. At the same time, we're looking at, so we've got a partnership with NVIDIA at the moment, and they're building what we think might be Europe's biggest supercomputer in Cambridge, UK at the moment. And we were asked to think of problems that could stress out such a supercomputer. And as we were saying earlier, the one we've come up with is exploring a a chemical space with 10 to the 60 possibilities within it. So it'd be fascinating to see over that 5-year period whether it's supercomputers that are going to solve this kind of thing for us, or are we going to gradually move more to quantum? And is it more about the raw compute, or how we start to rethink and reimagine how we actually code and build the algorithms for these machines?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's where it's at. It reminds me of GPUs 10 years ago, right? Everybody 10 or 15 years ago, and you mentioned NVIDIA, so might as well run with that. You know, the promise of what you could do, at least on paper, with a GPU, but the algorithms weren't written. And then machine learning came along, and now we've got a great use for GPUs, but there was always that raw horsepower in the IO of bringing things across a GPU that was there, but it just wasn't tapped. We needed to change the algorithms. We need to find the problems that would benefit from those. So I know that quantum has a much bigger potential there, but I feel like where you're at, Jim, is we've got to, right? You just can't take a standard algorithm and throw it at a quantum computer. It's got to be a special class of problems and written a certain way. So I think once we can do that, then we'll start really unlocking the potential. One other thing I would say, I agree, a 5-year horizon there. I think there's transformations, but I would tend to think for discovery to really know it'll be more of a 10-year or longer. I do think some point that Jim brought up earlier about accuracy versus speed is interesting. The tough one on accuracy, right, is nobody will know the final score for many years down the road. So I think that's the challenge with some of these things, especially on the early phase. We can come up with, you know, halftime scores, if you will. We'll know what it's looking like, and that's the predictor of maybe how the final score will go pretty good. But you know, ultimately, until the drug's approved, we can talk about other metrics of success like speed, or how we got to, you know, hit the lead in different aspects. But ultimately, out the other side and making a difference on the bottom line just does take so long. So Rohit, I agree. I think you know, we're gonna have to think about a little bit longer time horizons for maybe the ultimate metric, but some of these intermediate metrics we'll definitely need to build the business case, as Jim said, to prove the value in the intermediate term.
Yeah, adding to that, Wade, the other thing is that there is a boatload of investment going in this space finally. So at the last count, you know, I've been trying to keep up, but there are more than 250 startups, maybe in the drug discovery space, AI for drug discovery space, in all the phases, whether they be, you know, preclinical or clinical trials or at the molecular level, right? And billions of dollars are going in investments, and all of you pharma companies are partnering with some of these startups. So I think there will be a shortage of talent as well. And some of the initiatives I've been reading about, what Jim is doing in partnership with the University of Cambridge, will go a long way. We'll definitely need a lot of talented people attracted to the space. And yeah, and then one other thought, which is again a little sci-fi, but I think just like AI is already doing art, and we are reading all about it now, AI is able to discover art and do art. I think there'll be AI scientists which will become famous, and I don't know who will be cultivating or nurturing these scientists, but I think some AI scientists are coming up very soon.
Yeah, I'd like to throw one more perspective in. I think one way we'll stand a chance of getting some kind of transformation in the next 5 years is to put properly scaled solutions in the hands of our scientists, you know, rather than one-off exploratory solutions. So if you think about how some of the big tech companies have succeeded, it's because they've taken an engineering approach and a sort of design-centric approach to producing new tools, and then rolled them out at scale, whether that's to their employees or indeed the world. Through a website or something. I think we need to take a slice of their thinking and say, how do we produce engineered solutions for drug discovery that really walk the talk, and then you could roll out to hundreds or thousands of scientists rather than just one or two. That could potentially be transformative, regardless of the solution, but taking that kind of approach.
Certainly, I think that's the need to do this from an engineering perspective, and as Rohit mentioned early on, getting all the data, putting it through there, standardizing and really extracting it at scale in order to get the most value. If you're going to do this, one-off is not the most efficient by any means. So engineering at scale. Well, I think our time is up for the panel. I want to thank everybody for such great discussion, Jim and Rohit, and it's really been fascinating just to see what everybody's working on and hear their perspectives on the future directions of AI.
Same here. Thanks, Wade.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Thank you to Jim and Rohit, and also a special thank you to Wade for moderating. This has been a great conversation. Yeah, the audience is giving you a huge virtual round of applause. All right, for the audience, it's time for you to make your way to your next session. Along the way, make sure you accept your connection request and check out our amazing AI exhibits. Thanks so much, and we'll see you around.